Today is Thursday, July 2nd, 2026, and today is I Forgot Day, which, ironically, I almost forgot. Fortunately, I remembered just in time. And after digging through today's stories, I noticed that they all had something in common. None of them became important overnight. An entire nation celebrates the wrong day. One of the greatest movies ever made almost never made it to theaters. And a sport practiced for centuries had to wait until the 21st century to finally become Olympic. Sometimes history doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it has to wait for everyone else to catch up. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and someone who apparently spends an unhealthy amount of time wandering through historical rabbit holes so you don't have to. When Americans celebrate Independence Day, they celebrate July 4th. Fireworks, parades, cookouts, flags, but here's the important part. The United States actually voted for independence on July 2nd. On July 2nd, 1776, the Second Continental Congress approved Richard Henry Lee's resolution declaring that American colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The decision had been made. The colonies had officially chosen independence from Great Britain. So why don't we celebrate July 2nd? Because 2 days later, on July 4th, Congress approved the final wording of the Declaration of Independence. That beautifully written document became a symbol everyone remembered. The vote became history. The document became legend. One person who definitely thought America would celebrate July 2nd was John Adams. Writing to his wife Abigail, Adams predicted the day would be remembered forever. He imagined pomp and parade, shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. Honestly, he described the holiday almost perfectly. He just missed the date by 2 days. I've always loved that detail. Even one of America's founding fathers couldn't predict which moment history would remember. It reminds us that history doesn't always become famous on the day it actually happens. Sometimes the story that people remember is the one that's easiest to tell. And of course, sometimes history almost doesn't happen at all. On July 2nd, 1985, Back to the Future premiered. Today, it's almost impossible to imagine a world without it. The DeLorean, the flux capacitor, roads. Where we're going, we don't need roads. It's become one of the most beloved movies ever made. But here's what most people don't know. Back to the Future almost never happened. Studio after studio rejected it. Some thought audiences wouldn't understand the story. Disney reportedly passed because Marty's mother developing feelings for his future son, even unknowingly, was considered too uncomfortable for a family film. Other studios wanted the script changed. Some wanted it made darker. Others wanted it made sillier. Even after production began, things weren't settled. Eric Stoltz had already filmed several weeks as Marty McFly before the filmmakers made the incredibly difficult decision to replace him with Michael J. Fox. That meant reshooting huge portions of the movie. It was expensive, risky, and there was no guarantee it would work. Fortunately, it did. Then there's the DeLorean. The filmmakers chose it partly because they thought if a time traveler suddenly crashed into a barn in 1955, farmers might reasonably assume they'd just witnessed a flying saucer. That's exactly the kind of wonderfully weird logic I appreciate. Looking back now, Back to the Future feels inevitable. But it wasn't. It survived rejection, creative disagreements, casting changes, and enormous financial risk. Sometimes the classics we can't imagine living without came surprisingly close to never existing at all. And our final story reminds us, sometimes the world simply takes a long time to recognize something that's been extraordinary all along. On July 2nd, 2021, the world got its first real look at something that had been centuries in the making, Olympic surfing. Now, technically, the competition itself took place later during the Tokyo Olympics. But on July 2nd, the final preparations and athlete introductions were bringing the sport into the Olympic spotlight for the very first time. And that made me wonder, how does the sport practiced for hundreds of years take so long to become an Olympic event? Surfing has existed for centuries. Long before it became associated with California beaches and endless summer movies, it was deeply woven into the culture of Polynesia, especially Hawaii. It wasn't just recreation. It was tradition. It was skill. It was identity. By the 20th century, surfing had spread around the world. Professional competitions emerged. World champions were crowned. Entire industries formed around boards, clothing, photography, and travel. By almost every measure, it was already a major international sport. Except for one thing. It wasn't Olympic. The Olympic Games have always evolved. Sports come and go. Some disappear. Others spend decades trying to earn a place on the world's biggest athletic stage. Surfing finally joined the program because the International Olympic Committee wanted to showcase sports that connected with younger audiences and reflected cultures from around the world. And honestly, it was about time. Watching athletes ride waves that can't be controlled, can't be repeated, and can't even be predicted with complete certainty is unlike any other Olympic event. A sprinter knows exactly where the track will be. A swimmer knows exactly what the pool will look like. A surfer, the playing field changes every few seconds. Nature becomes part of the competition. Sometimes ideas aren't rejected because they're bad. Sometimes they're simply waiting for the world to recognize what was already there. And that brings us to today's birthday. Someone whose career is another reminder that lasting change usually doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens one case, one argument, and one victory at a time. Born on July 2nd, 1908, Thurgood Marshall became one of the most influential lawyers in American history before he ever put on a Supreme Court robe. Most people remember him as the first black justice of the United States Supreme Court. And that's certainly historic. But what amazes me is everything he accomplished before he got there. As an attorney for the NAACP, Marshall argued case after case challenging segregation and discrimination. He appeared before the Supreme Court 32 times and won 29 of those cases. Just think about that for a second. Winning once before the Supreme Court is an extraordinary achievement. Winning 29 times is almost unbelievable. His most famous victory came in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. The court unanimously ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. That single decision fundamentally changed American education and became one of the defining civil rights victories of the 20th century. Years later, President Lyndon Johnson appointed Marshall to the Supreme Court itself. It was a moment of history, but it wasn't the beginning of his legacy. It was the recognition of work he had already been doing for decades. That's something I really admire. Marshall understood that changing a country isn't usually about one dramatic speech. It's about showing up, doing the work, making the argument, and refusing to quit. And looking back across today's stories, I kept noticing the same pattern. The biggest ideas often spent years waiting for recognition. America voted for independence on July 2nd, but history chose to celebrate July 4th. Back to the Future survived rejection after rejection before becoming one of the most beloved movies ever made. Surfing spent centuries proving itself before finally reaching the Olympic Games. And Thurgood Marshall spent decades changing American law before taking his seat on the highest court in the country. History doesn't always reward great ideas immediately. Sometimes they have to wait. Sometimes people have to catch up. Sometimes the timing matters just as much as the idea itself. Anyway, that's July 2nd, a day that proves some of history's biggest moments spent years waiting for the recognition they deserve. I'll leave you with this. The arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice. Martin Luther King, Jr. If you'd like to explore more of my work, books, narration, or ongoing historical curiosity, You can find it all at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm CL Burns, and I'm glad you were here for this one. I'll see you tomorrow.